Up until now, everything we did was very technical, but say goodbye to technicalities and say hello to visual fun. From here on, we're going to be focusing on creating beautiful things. And we're going to start off from taking a deeper look into the background attribute. And we're going to see a lot of different ways to work with the background. And in the process, you're going to learn a lot about how CSS works. So really what we're doing here, although it's probably a little bit more longer than you would expect from future videos, it's going to help you kind of grasp the basic concepts in CSS and how structures of properties work in CSS. So let's get right to it. Let's start chapter 3 with a gusto. And our main focus is going to be backgrounds and really looking deep into properties and seeing how many of the properties in CSS work. So to do that, I'm going to start off, we took a gander at background color already, and we saw how we could add different colors into our background. Now, what I want to do is I'm just going to break a line for the sake of visual pleasure, really. And in a real-world application, you would probably use some sort of condenser to condense all of your code, which we'll talk about that in other courses, but don't worry about it, especially not now when you don't have massive applications. Try to build your applications to be the most easy for you to read, so you could break lines easily. Alright, so now that we've seen the background color, I want to move on to the next item. And the next item is going to be background image. So basically I just type background and I search for the word image or type it in. Once I do that, the next step is I set a URL and opening it and closing a round bracket. And I always end it with a semicolon because I have more things afterwards to make sure that the rule will be applied. And I'm sending inside a string, so I'm going to wrap it around with a quote. So I'm putting here a quote to start, a quote to end, and then I'm going to put my image itself. Now, if we take a look into our CSS site itself, we'll see something very interesting. So first of all, in our site itself, we'll see that we have here our CSS that's sitting inside of the style folder. But inside of our images folder, this is where I have a pattern that I want to add right inside. This pattern is actually transparent. So this is a transparent pattern. Now, this transparent pattern will enable me to also not only see that background color that I have, but on top of it to put this pattern that I want to put above. Now it's very easy to put it in, but I have to naturally on a real website, you might start with a slash. Now when you start with a slash, it basically means the root of your website. In our case, we don't have a root to our website, but really the root to our website will be basically no folder because I'm in a local folder in my website, on my local host. But if I would be working on a real website with a www. Whatever it would be, if I would set my pattern to be starting with a slash, I would basically start from the root directory of that site. So if it's 0 to geek.com, then it would start from that 0 to geek.com root folder. If I don't put anything, that means that I'm going to be positioned right inside the same place that I'm in. In this case, my style, the style is inside of the folder. CSS, so right now, our path assumes that we're going to find something inside of that path. In reality, what we want to do is we want to say, hey, we want to go back one folder back. To do that, I'm going to type 2 dots and then a slash, which will basically tell me I'm going to the folder that's before you. The next step is I want to go to the image folder and then into the pat.png. So let's go ahead. It's going to be image folder, pat.png. And there we go. That's all I had to do to create this pattern and connect this image to my CSS. Obviously, this image would have to be on our server as well to load up. But once I click on refresh, you'll see that now this pattern has been added to our application. Now, by the way, while you were gone, I just added a little bit more text for the sake of the sample. So if you have not done that yet, just make sure, or if you're working on your own original script, make sure that it's scrollable. And if it's not scrollable, just go right into your index.html and just add a few more text to make sure that it is, so we could talk about our next few topics. Alright, so the next thing that I want to talk about is, by default, when we put our image, because it was so small, it automatically repeated basically on our x-axis and also our y-axis. To be able to control and say, hey, I only want to repeat on the x-axis or only on the y, or maybe I don't want to have any repetition at all, that's when we introduce a new property. And that property is background repeat. And for our background repeat, the default, which if we don't do anything, is repeat. And that is the default unless we overrode that default by doing some CSS that overrode it. But by default, that would be our pattern. Now, if I wanted to have a repeat of my x, I would just do repeat minus x or dash x. And repeat that dash x will basically enable me to have a repetition that's only going in one direction. Now, on the other hand, if I wanted to create a repetition that is only on the y-axis, then I would set it to be a repeat y. So I'm going to go ahead here and just click on refresh. And you'll see that now only my y-axis has that repeat pattern going on. Last but not least, what if you don't want to have any repetition at all? And for that, you'll just set no repeat. And by doing that, you're going to set up and make sure that there is no repetition. Now notice everything you see how we only have that square right there. Now, just set it to be repeat x. And again, you don't have to memorize. It's really about knowing it. Once you know it, then just search it up and have a document in front of you of all the different possibilities. And we'll try to make sure that we add an attachment of all the different options that we covered in the lesson. Alright, so and even to make it a little bit more, I'll just make sure that I'm going to add it into the source files right here, so you'll be able to have a reference to all the different options that you have in all these properties that we've been talking about. Alright, so now that we've talked about that and then we set our repeat to be y, I want to go over and continue on to another background element that we control. Now, the next element that we could control is basically, is the item scrollable or not? Now, to be able to show that, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to actually do a repeat x so we could actually see it. But basically what's going on is, if our background is up here and I scroll down on my screen, then that background is not coming with me. It's staying where it's at. Now, I'm just going to make sure that I have even a little bit more text here so I could show this sample in a much more vivid way. And I want to showcase the next background option. Now, the next background option is called background attachment. Now, the background attachment is simple as well. It has two options. One is scroll. And the scroll option, what it does is basically, as the name applies, it basically is connected to where it's at, and it's not, technically, it's connected to where it's at. Contrary to that, the option of fixed, so if I set here to be our attachment, let me just save this. I might have not saved it actually. That could explain it. Alright, so I'm going to go there and click on and save it with the fixed option instead. And when I set it to be fixed, notice the difference. Now with fixed, my position is going to be on my axis exactly in this point where it's at by default. But as I scroll, notice what's going to happen. That background remains exactly where it is. This is a perfect scenario where you want to have a background that does not scroll, that stays with the user and continues showing exactly the same thing while the content scrolls but not the background. The default, by the way, was that scroll that we had previously. So if we wanted to change it, then we would set it to be fixed, and by setting it to fixed, then that background itself would not scroll. It would be actually connected directly and not moving. In other words, as we move our elements on our screen, the background would remain in the same position that it was at. Now notice one more thing is when we're scrolling, notice how this background, because we set a red background and another background here, these backgrounds are overshadowing that background, making it invisible until we cross over and pass that background. Alright, we're almost done. We have one more property to cover with the background properties. And that background property is background position. Now the background position has a lot of different options. And some of these options are basically to configure where do we want our background to be. For example, we want our background, even though we have here this repetition that's going on, so the repetition of x, I'm going to go ahead here and set it to be no repeat for a second, just for the sake of showcasing our options here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say to it, hey, by the way, I want you to be in 20% and 8% in your position. Or in other words, I want your background to be pushed in its location to move down 8% from the top and 20% from the left. Now, I could have set it in any values that I wanted, so this would control my left and this would control my top. Another option is I could have set it with hard-coded values using pixels, so I could have said 10 pixels, 10 pixels, giving me a 10 pixel gap in my element. If I just save this here for a second and go back into my application and click on refresh, we'll see that now it's going to have a nice little spacing in my element. Now, if I turned on my repetition again, if I had my repeat x, notice what would happen. So it's kind of an important thing to note and also understand is that our element, although we're going to be moved down by 10 pixels, we're seeing that it is flushed all the way to the end anyways. Now the reason is very simple, is because the repetition is happening, but the image original alignment is going to be aligned a little bit further. To make it a little bit more extreme, if I go ahead here and I'll just set here even 200 as our position, if I click on refresh, we'll see that even though I set it to be 200, still all the repetitions are still happening. The only thing is that the start point of our image is going to be set to that specific point. So I'm going to go ahead here and set it back to no repeat, because I want to continue talking about different options that we have with our background position. The last styling capability is actually typing words. And I could literally say, I want you to be on the top, or bottom, or center. And the second parameter, so first parameter will control top, center, bottom. And the second parameter would control, again, top, center, left, center, right. Or, and go ahead here, if I click on refresh, we'll see here that we have here, our image is now right smack in the middle. If I wanted it to be, for example, in the left, then I would just set it to be left, center, and if I would go ahead here and click on refresh, we would see that my item would be on the left and in the center. And if I wanted to, I could have set also it to be on the bottom, making sure that my bottom left is configured so it would always be on my bottom left no matter where I am at. We could close that so we could see it more vividly. So that's it. That covers all the different properties of the background and all the ways you could actually work with the background. What I want to talk about is one more small thing, is I'm going to go ahead here and I'm just going to add here a comment, and in the process show you how to create CSS comments. So I'm just going to go ahead right into my CSS. I'm going to open up a comment by typing these characters that I just typed on the screen and close it. Basically /*/*. And notice I've just added here basically the different types of options that you have for your elements, and notice where the default, I'll just put here a round bracket so you know, but this is the example of what you could do with it, and this is the default. The default here is repeat, the default here is scroll, the default here is basically 0, 0. So I can't really write it down there, but these are your three different options, all your different options of all your configurations, and I'm going to try to make sure that I paste these into samples as we go on from here on.